Let's find out what Alan Moore thinks of Frank Miller. Hey comic freaks, and welcome back to Dangerous Comics. I'm your host, Dane Georges, and today we're looking at The Daredevils, number 1. Now this is a Marvel UK comic that came out in 1983, and it's notable because it features the talents of Alan Moore, Alan Davis, Frank Miller, Gary Leach, and has a backup of an old Spider-Man story from Stan Lee and John Romita. You can see everyone's featured here on the cover, and they were even giving out a free badge. Sadly, my issue does not come with the free badge. You can see that it is magazine size. Here is a traditional comic size, and we'll take a look at this a little bit later because the Alan Moore story that's published in the Daredevils is his first issue of Captain Britain, and that gets later printed in X-Men Archives. Starting with issue number 2 is when his story starts. So we'll dive into that when we look at his story a little bit deeper. But just to give a little bit more context to what this is, this magazine came out in 1983, like I said, and it was kind of in response to some of the other magazines that were coming out in Britain. You know, comics were gaining popularity, and Marvel wanted to take advantage of that market. Notably, there's speculation that this was trying to compete with Warrior magazine. This is a later issue of number 10. Sadly, I don't have a number 1 of Warrior, but Warrior magazine would also be super notable for Alan Moore's work as well. And Alan Moore is all over the Daredevils and this imprint. You can tell that the people at Marvel UK saw his talent. They wanted to put this guy to work, and they were just giving him everything. Because Alan Moore does more than just the Captain Britain piece that's in here. He also does a text piece, and he would continue to do a column moving forward in the other issues of the Daredevils. And they're super cool. He does one on sexism in comics and a retrospective on Stan Lee, so really cool. And obviously his work is all over Warrior. This is where Marvel Man first appeared, later known as Miracle Man, but this is where that story first appeared alongside other notable Alan Moore work like V for Vendetta, which he did with David Lloyd. You can see it here. Wow. And it just looks so great in black and white and oversized for the magazine edition. But, you know, we can take a look at this separately. This could be its own episode, right? Warrior is such a cool publication. But just want to give a little context to what was also out there in the market and what Alan Moore would later go on to work on. And with the Daredevils, we'll just jump on in, but we see a table of contents here showing what we can expect. I also think it's really interesting. You know, the series is called The Daredevils, and obviously Daredevil is in here, but he doesn't appear till page 15, but it's interesting that they put it first in the table of contents because they probably think, hey, that's what people are coming here for. But I think that really speaks to like what an impact Frank Miller's work had even overseas, like that this whole publication is centered around Frank Miller's Daredevil run, because that's what we're starting with. And the Daredevil story that's printed here is Daredevil number 159. And luckily, I have the Daredevil Frank Miller Artist Edition, and in there are a few pages from this issue. So I just wanted to highlight right here from the start, we are getting The Secrets of Daredevil's Billy Club, and that was actually page 31 in Daredevil 159. It's not included in this magazine. This page is cut out. They just include it here in the table of contents. But you can see how they cut up that title up there and then they reformatted it. We lose the bottom 3 panels, but I just wanted to call out how they reformatted, repurposed. I always love seeing how publications kind of reuse material like that and make it fit regardless, because you got to fill the space. So right off the bat, we get a little taste of Frank Miller right on page 1. So this is supposed to be targeted toward a little bit of an older audience. You're going after a crowd that would have been reading Warrior. So they're trying to kind of aim for that and level up the comics. I think that's especially why we're zeroing in on Frank Miller's work, because that was such a different, unique take on comics for the time. And starting off, the first story we have here is A Rag, a Bone, a Hank of Hair by Alan Moore and Alan Davis. And this is the first Captain Britain story that Alan Moore did. And like I was saying earlier, this is also republished or reprinted in X-Men Archives. It's later been collected in paperbacks as well. You can definitely find Alan Moore's run on this. This starts with the previous run, which was being written by Dave Thorpe before Alan Moore took over. And it's really interesting how Alan Moore kind of just rolls with the punches and takes the plot threads that Dave set up. And you can see how I love how this includes the original covers too. So some of this was in Marvel superheroes before they changed the title to Daredevils. So interesting how Captain Britain was kind of shuffled around for a little bit and never really had his own magazine. But we see there's 2 stories before we get to the Daredevils #1 with Alan Moore's first story. And I believe Alan Moore might have requested this, or at least they set it up for him, that there is a death of Captain Britain, the issue before Alan Moore steps in. And it kind of clears the slate, right? Kind of sets it up so he can just take it and run and take it in maybe a new direction. Interestingly, he does keep a lot of the same plot threads throughout. I just want to show some of the colors, because one thing that's really cool about seeing this in the magazine is that we get to see it in a larger scale, and we get to see it in black and white and really just take in that beautiful Alan Davis work. And I love how we start just this slow zoom in from space to this like moon asteroid looking thing and just getting closer and closer. And the details go from craters to being technology as we're going deep down this tunnel, kind of like we're going into the Death Star almost. And then we get to these 2 overlooking the science and technology, and we learn that it's Merlin and his assistant. But really cool to see the adaptation of using color here, because I think in the X-Men archives, they do a really good job of kind of having subdued colors and still using the tones and everything that was in the original printing. And there is some really nice texture in these, right? Like there's a little bit of grayscale going on to kind of show the memories and kind of give us a distinction. But wow, just beautiful detailed work. And I think when you see it in this color and the heavy blacks that Alan Davis is using and everything, I think you can see how it was black and white, and really the color is just like an added bonus on this because it looks beautiful in its original format. But Alan Moore and Alan Davis would go on to do quite a few Captain Britain stories, with the rest of their run also being collected in X-Men archives with these following issues. So if you're interested in this run, these are a really great place to start. Like I said, you can find this in other formats, but if you're a purist and you want to read this in issue format, I really love these X-Men archives. And what's probably most interesting about this first story is really like we're seeing very early themes and explorations from Alan Moore that would go on to be done in his other work. So like I said, we set it up that Captain Britain died, and now Merlin and Roma reconstructing Captain Britain from scratch. So we see Captain Britain is dead, and then we see literally just his skeleton here. They're working from literally bare bones of putting him back together. And throughout this, we're getting this really cool just flashback of Captain Britain's history, you know, him losing his parents, getting the amulet, becoming Captain Britain, his old costume, everything, and then moving into where Alan Davis and David Thrope were taking the story afterwards. So we get a really full context of where the story's been and then setting up for where it's going to go. And I think that's really, really interesting because probably the best known Alan Moore reconstruction is probably Swamp Thing, right? Literally, with the first issue of his saga of Swamp Thing is the anatomy lesson, which is all about exploring Swamp Thing's history and his origin and taking a look at it through a new lens, which is something that Alan Moore just has constantly brought to his work, taking a look at something but then twisting it slightly to analyze it in a way that we haven't thought about it before. With Swamp Thing, it's Alec Holland died in the swamp, and Swamp Thing is just a group of vegetables that believes it's a man. And that switch of thinking he's no longer a man, that's how he previously was before this issue. He was a man trying to regain his humanity. But with Saga of Swamp Thing and Alan Moore's run, he becomes a vegetable or a collection of plants that kind of has to grapple with what does it mean to be a human, or what does it mean to think you're a human, and what happens when you let go of those boundaries. And I think we see a lot of that in Captain Britain as well, right? We're seeing Merlin put him back together, and we're just getting this idea that maybe there's a bigger piece to his origin, maybe there's a bigger piece to his history that we don't know about. And once again, that just makes me think of Miracle Man as well, or Marvel Man, as I showed earlier for Warrior Magazine. This is the Marvel reprints that they did back in 2014. These are really nice. They're recolored, and obviously these were out of print for so long because of Warrior Magazine, because of the rights, because of the name and everything. So really cool that Marvel was able to put these back out. But once again, a total just diving into character, right? And just looking at what would it mean for a character like Shazam, who has a duality of personality, what would that look like in a real world kind of setting, but not looking down at it, looking down on the old comics and thinking they're just garbage trash. No, this is celebrating that, but yet taking it with a new spin. And I think that's what I love looking at a writer and artist's body of work, because I think you see a lot of those kind of themes coming up early. And we can see this is something that Alan Moore had in his mind. It was something he was toying with, and he's just playing with it here with Captain Britain. What does it mean to put this hero back together and then just analyze it? What does it mean? Okay, so Merlin gave him his powers. What if we start looking at Merlin in a different way of maybe he's not so benevolent, maybe he's doing this with ill intent? And just kind of taking what could be simple comic book escapism tropes and kind of giving them a little bit of an edge, a little bit of a further development, a little bit of a grounded edge. And that's not to say that like all comics need to be like that, right? Like I think after the 80s, because that's something that Frank Miller and Alan Moore probably are best known for, is kind of bringing that edge back to comics, or bringing comics into the adult world more and more, and just looking at it with respect and giving it kind of its due. And just beautiful art by Alan Davis overall. I love how he can do these like cartoon characters, Jackdaw, the little elfy guy, and then I love how we can turn the page and get this amazing splash image of Merlin breathing life back into Captain Britain, and we see him falling back to his realm from space. And we get some really cool characters in there. There's Alan Davis doing like Spider-Man and that cross-hatching and everything, but so cool. All the characters that have been in the run so far. And I think that's another piece of this too, is just how well Alan Moore plays with others, right? That is something I think that has kind of gone the wayside in more current comics. It's definitely like comics were a game of telephone, right? Like it's one writer, artist passing the torch to the next ones and them having to figure out what to do with the toys they were left with. And I think Alan Moore exceeds at that because he takes those toys and he makes them his own. But he doesn't destroy the toys completely or throw away what the other team had done before. He really ties it all in and makes it a unified piece, and maybe even gives more meaning to the older work than there was before. So I can't say enough about Alan Moore. I think this is such a fun first foray into his Captain Britain story. It's just really cool how he resets the stage and then sets it up for something even bigger and more fun. And then I think it's really cool to see how he's exploring these themes that we get to see him take into other stories like Marvel Man, Miracle Man, and Swamp Thing. And before we even get to Frank Miller himself, before we get to Daredevil number 159, we get this amazing text piece from Alan Moore called The Importance of Being Frank. And if you ever wanted to know what your favorite creator, Alan Moore, thought about one of your other favorite creators, Frank Miller, wonder no more, because it's all here. And I eat this shit up. I live for this. I cannot get enough of like creators talking craft, and having a creator talking about another creator and what they like about them is so cool. And especially a creator like Frank Miller. In my mind, these two creators really defined comics in the 80s, right? With their seminal works of Frank Miller, Ronin, Dark Knight Returns, and Alan Moore with Watchmen. It's like, what more can you say? Those two were taking these concepts and just taking them to a whole new level. And this text piece is so fun. There's so many great pull quotes here. We start off with, "Listen, don't you kids try to talk to me about comics. I've been reading the damn things for the last 22 years, and I'm bitter, jaded, and cynical in terminal proportions. I was there back in 1961 when Marvel Comics began their grand experiment in attempting to endow two-dimensional superheroes with believable personality quirks and genuine human anxieties. I was there a few years later when the noble enterprise had sunken back into the weary, formalized rut. It had seemed that in order to become a superhero, you had to have a bad leg, a dicky ticker, or a maiden aunt with chronic varicose veins." Fun to see him injecting a little bit of humor here too, but I think that also speaks to maybe why Alan Moore is such a great writer and why he's able to twist these concepts so well and play with this medium. Like, he was there at the beginning. He's been consuming comics from the start of this superhero rise, and I think with that brings that experience of these tropes and what's expected and then how he can change it. He just has that experience. And really cool to see that he was still getting these comics being overseas. These American comics were still making their way over, that he could consume these. So listen, don't talk to me about comics. It's too painful. So, seeing how he's seen it all. But with Frank Miller, he sees something different, something special. Now, given the fact that I'm old, cranky, and unreasonable, it shouldn't surprise you that I greeted the arrival of Frank Miller with pessimism and little enthusiasm for his future within the comics medium. I remember an evening over at Steve Moore's place where we both were thumbing through a stack of Daredevils and growing uncharacteristically excited about the low-key drama of the storytelling. I don't know what we're getting worked up about this stuff for. Within a couple of years, this Miller guy is going to have an ego the size of Wembley and drift off to draw coffee table extravaganzas full of moody barbarians with naked women surgically grafted to their legs. A couple years later, I was introduced to Frank Miller while we were both guests at the 82 Comic Anno convention, and it grieves me to report that he is one of the nicest guys you could ever hope to meet. His ego is constrained entirely. You live and learn, lads, you live and learn. So I love that he had that initial thought that, this guy, probably doesn't have legs to stay in comics, but look at him now. The guy is still drawing covers for Marvel. And I see a lot of hate out there for Frank Miller. I love to see an artist change and develop, and I love how his style has just gotten blockier and just more stylized as he's gone along. I love to see that kind of development. I think we kind of see a little bit of that in Kirby when he was getting older as well. Now, it strikes me at this point in my narrative that you may well be those amongst you whose first exposure to the extraordinary abilities of Mr. Miller is in this issue of the Daredevils. His tone, it definitely just reflects overall deep respect. He's also making ties. There's the origin issue where we're seeing Matt Murdock chase down his father's killer, and he's in the subway, and Miller's making a tie to Bernie Krigstein's Master Race. He's also making a lot of ties to Eisner's work of how he would incorporate the Daredevil title into the cityscape and everything. So he just sees that love that Miller has for the medium, and I think that's a love that Moore also shares. And I think that love is why they're able to just bring this work to a whole new level, because they're not looking down their nose at comics. They love comics. This is the medium they want to work in. This is the medium they've chosen to tell stories in. And he sees an artist who's revolutionized narrative potential of comics already. And he's emphasizing, character psychology, nuanced storytelling, the ability to blend Eastern and Western influences. He also just speaks a lot about how Miller came into his own more and more when he started to write the book himself and truly become a cartoonist. After all, a writer and artist working in collaboration with each other have always got someone else to blame if the script doesn't work. Starting with issue 168, Miller would have no one but himself to blame if the series dive bombed. It didn't. It flourished. Over a space of a few issues, Miller's writing became self-assured as his artwork, and his confidence increased. We began to see more and more daring graphic storytelling devices creeping into the pages of Daredevil, and just calling out this great storytelling of letting a moment be silent and using the black and white of the page of having a character his hand come out of the darkness just to stop that pool ball. And he also calls out the kind of changes that Miller was able to bring to characters and characterization. And later in this issue, we actually do get this reprinting of an Amazing Spider-Man issue by Stan Lee and John Romita. And in it, we have the Kingpin as the villain, which I think is cool context because the Kingpin goes on to be such a big villain in Miller's Daredevil run. And Moore is really calling out of how he brought that character into a whole other realm of really boosting the emotional impact that character had and making him a true monster, and just calling out here how that character made that transformation and how well Miller just sold all that acting and the faces and in the body language. I think it's preferable that I should try and isolate some of the elements of Miller's technique and try to find exactly what it is that makes him such an original and influential figure on today's comic landscape. And that is true, right? Because Miller changed the game. And I love that we get this inclusion too, because we got this awesome shot, and Moore's calling out how cool it is of the storytelling going from top to bottom with these caption boxes. And this panel is a direct inspiration for the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as well, because there is a very similar panel to this in that first issue as the Turtles go back underground. So, without Miller, we wouldn't have the Turtles. which is another, like, that impact is huge through pop culture. He's also calling out how Miller would adapt to use more captions rather than thought balloons, and kind of how thought balloons are a little bit of a cheat in Moore's eyes in the way that a lot of artists in traditional comics, as he says, they either could draw two faces, mouth closed or mouth open, which I think is really funny. So he said you really had to rely on those kind of thought balloons to actually tell the reader what they were thinking and feeling. And he's saying with Miller's work, there's no doubt. You see it right on the characters' faces, right in the way they act. And then I think it's really cool and very forward thinking that Moore also brings up here the influence that Japanese comics had on Frank Miller. And we have a direct call out here for Baby Carriage and Wolf, which is Lone Wolf and Cub. And we get 4 panels pulled out from here to show off from Japanese strip, Baby Carriage and Wolf, Frank Miller's favorite strip. And Moore speaks to this kind of storytelling of quiet moments and how imposing the scene becomes just through going from shadow, moving up, and seeing more of just these soldiers crossing the scene. He says if Frank Miller keeps moving forward, both through the agency of his new maxi series for DC Comics and through whichever other areas he chooses to apply his talents to, then I think we may be in for some rare treats in the years to come. Of course, if in 3 years' time no trace remains of Mr. Miller beyond a couple of luxurious good girl art portfolios featuring Elektra and the Black Widow, then I may keep my critical opinions open by being the first to say, I told you so. I love that he's keeping that edge of being like, okay, I've put all this out here. I think this guy's got a huge potential, but if that changes, I told you so, that he's still just going to go and be a coffee table artist. But, this forward thinking of seeing the kind of impact that his maxi series for DC is about to have, Ronin didn't have as big of a punch, but still had quite an impact later. And that led to him doing Dark Knight Returns and then later doing Batman Year One and on and on. So Moore saw where this was going and where his potential was, and it's truly infinite. So I love that he's still tongue-in-cheek being like, but, if he ends up just drawing coffee table books, I told you so. So it's just a really cool article, right? Like, how often do you get to hear or read one of your favorite creators talk about another favorite creators, and both just at such an early point of their career, like especially for Alan Moore. I love that he's already calling himself old and jaded when he's hasn't even gone on to do any of his amazing, spectacular work. He's just now starting on all these opportunities, just starting on Captain Britain that's going to lead to so many other work with Warrior, 2000 AD, and then eventually going to the American market with DC, with Swamp Thing, and then Watchmen. So really cool to see where he's at and how he's predicting the future. And we get into the Daredevil story of this issue. And this is a reprint, like I said, of issue 159. It is kind of interesting how they formatted it. This is an oversized magazine edition, so we do kind of have a little bit of an issue of the gutter. I think that's really funny how his arm's so long because it's extended by this gutter. If they buttered them against each other, you'd have a lot of space on the outside. So it's kind of a fraught instance, right? This is the problem of reprinting work that was meant to be traditional comic book size. It's interesting that they do start with this issue because technically Frank Miller started on Daredevil 158. And like Alan Moore was calling out in his write-up, Frank Miller is not writing the story yet. This is done by Roger McKenzie with Frank Miller on pencils, Klaus Janson as inker, and Jim Novak as letterer. And it's such a great marriage of Miller and Janson here. You see them already just swinging for the fences with amazing lighting on this guy's face. He just looks so creepy. This could be done so many other ways, but it's so dramatic the way they set this up. There's that acting and just attention to detail. And I think we see Miller just continue to evolve as he's on this series. This is still pretty early for him. Just showing off, we've seen just these kind of shots a million times, even from Steve Ditko or Jack Kirby, but Miller kind of takes it in a new way, and I think it's just that dramatic lighting, how everything has mood to it. Same thing with these panels, just amazing, just how that trash, so well lit, that face. You can tell he's really referencing a lot to kind of hit these shadows on the face, of the human face, and hit those planes. Just really bringing New York alive as almost a secondary character of this comic strip. Daredevil's going to the docks, but yeah, more just awesome rendering, man. And it's reprinted really nicely. This would have originally, been in color for the American comic, so it's cool to see it pulled out in the black and white. And oh man, that's another cool part of these Marvel UK books, or specifically Daredevils, is you would always get a color poster in the center. This is done by Gary Leach. And then they followed up with an amazing look at Gary Leach's early work. And I believe they did this for most of the artists that did posters, which is really cool. It's like Gary's work from when he was 13, now 11, 16, and then to his first work when he was published at 24. And you might be most familiar with Gary Leach's work from the early issues of Miracle Man / Marvel Man with Alan Moore. And his style is just so beautiful and detailed. He also did this cover of Warrior that I showed off earlier with the Warp Smiths. Man, just gorgeous. What an artist. I really love this Warp Smith story that's in here too. It has some really cool character designs, but man, look at those textures on the page and just scale that he's able to build. What a cool artist. So love seeing, some more early work. But man, just that action that Frank Miller brings to these pages as Daredevil's leaping off the dock into the water and then onto the boat. There's definitely like that Kirby locomotion in there, and then how he's bouncing his billy club off the ground and everything. I love that, the Luca effect of the club bouncing. And then, man, I love that as they're opening the panel up for when everyone's underwater, and that little bit of a panel break as Daredevil's swimming back to the top. Another text piece from Alan Moore, and this is fanzine reviews. So if you were ever interested in what kind of fanzines Alan Moore was reading, here you go. We have reviews for Fantasy Express, Fantasy Advisor, and Triple Echo. And then we also get a little portrait of Alan Moore down here in the corner. Doesn't look as old and jaded as he said in that other write-up. These issues of Daredevils really has a lot of really cool Alan Moore work that you might not have read before. And man, just more action here as everyone's tussling and bodies are just flying. And you really just see the mastery that Frank Miller has and what Klaus Janssen's bringing to the table. Like, just look at that, the inking of that rippling of the water. Wow, you can just see why this whole magazine would be built around Frank Miller like this, because this is amazing work. And the artist edition I showed off earlier for Frank Miller's Daredevil only has 2 pages from this issue they're showing. The first one being that diagram of how the Billy Club works, and the second one being this page 23 that we're looking at here. So really cool to see how well it was reproduced in this Marvel UK publication. Here it is without the lettering on it, but man, just gorgeous work. But pretty high fidelity printing for the time. I wonder what they were printing from, if it was plates, but man, it looks really crisp. Just look at those backgrounds too. They're really well done. And man, the ink splatter that's supposed to represent just the waves crashing against the pier. That's so cool. And that shadow of Daredevil being cast on that guy and building up to In the Hands of Bullseye. And throughout this book, or this series, Daredevils, they ended up printing Daredevil number 159 all the way to Daredevil number 170. So a pretty good chunk of Frank Miller's work. This would eventually be canceled, and it would become The Mighty World of Marvels. And we have our last strip here, which is To Die a Hero, which is by Stan Lee and John Romita. And it's kind of funny because I was looking at the letters in later issues, and people were hating on the inclusion of these old Stan Lee and John Romita stories, just kind of commenting on how childish they were in retrospect, which I think is kind of sad because maybe I'm just partial to John Romita's art. Stan Lee's writing could be a little cheesy sometimes and maybe for a younger audience, but I do think that's sad that this audience was looking at this and being like, why are you printing this? We want more adult media. And we do have this news feature that calls out Frank Miller's final issue of Daredevil, so you see how they're kind of catching up, right? Like I said, they got to issue 170, Miller's final issues being 191, so they don't quite make it all the way to the end of his run. Also get some other cool shoutouts for like The Thing, this Ghost Rider issue. I actually talked about on the channel the issue right before this where they introduced Zarathos, but this was the second issue of him kind of exploring his origin even more. So, if you're interested in that, go check out that issue. I'll have it linked in a card right there, so click that. More continuation of that classic Spidey comic, and man, just John Romita's art is so beautiful. I love his style. A little bit of romance comics in there too, especially like a panel like that. And I love that kind of inking there as Spidey throws up a web dome to protect them from the water, defining their shapes through cross-hatching. And there's some really awesome poses here too of Spidey like leaping out and punching, And then I love that pose of him holding onto the wall to dodge the bullet. Like, that's amazing. That's some really fun storytelling and keeping things dynamic. Man, and that kick, that's fun, just going from those two. But that is the end of that Spidey story. Next issue, Spidey finds Kingpin. We get this Comic Mart section, which I thought was really interesting. This is like people listing their name and address, and then all of the comics they're trying to sell or give away, and then all the comics they want. So just like a classified space for people to be like, hey, you want to trade with me? You want to sell? I've got this and I'm looking for that. More classified. And then we see some other Marvel UK titles. Marvel's Winter Special Explosion, 8 dynamic titles. We have Star Trek, some Uncanny X-Men, Silver Surfer, a Spider-Man and Hulk, and then also Daredevils, Doctor Who, and Blake 7. And this Starburst sweater offer on the back. I think this ran on most of the Daredevils issues. And we did see it called out on that ad for other Marvel titles. So I just wanted to plug this really quick too, that Doctor Who. These aren't from that time. These are probably a little later. These are 1987. But this is also another magazine Marvel was publishing and for Marvel UK and featured creators like Grant Morrison and Alan Moore doing stories in black and white. So this is another magazine I would love to check out on the channel. Leave a comment below if you are interested in that or if you have any favorite issues of Doctor Who magazine that you think I should check out. But I definitely think there's a really cool, rich history that Marvel UK has to offer and how it kind of cultivated these young and upcoming artists and really put some awesome talent to work and definitely put Alan Moore to work. Here is one of those text pieces that he did, Stan Lee, Blinded by the Hype. There's a lot of cool text pieces like that. Here's another one, Invisible Girls and Phantom Ladies, Sexism in Comics. So you can really tell they were just trying to keep Alan Moore busy and did not want him taken away by the competition. Here's another text piece he did. This is like a written piece that has just bought illustrations by Alan Davis about this hero Night Raven. What a cool body of work. What a cool publication. This gets me so jazzed and hyped just to make comics. And if this episode got you excited to check out comics like it did me, well, why not check out some of my comics? Hey, they might not be from the UK, but they're here from the good old US of A. And I've got series like Doomskull, which is about an ex-supervillain that works at a grocery store with his minion Bag Boy. I've got 3 issues of that in print, and I am so close to finishing issue 4. So close. Hang on there with me. I've also got zines like The Passenger and X-Ray, which is a collection of my 4-panel webcomics. And you can find all this and way more at DaneGeorges.com. I have all that linked in the description below, so please check it out. Your support means so much to me. And if you haven't, please consider subscribing. But until next time, remember to think and read dangerously.